Clair Obscur Expedition 33 isn't just an incredible game. It's a work of art. And like many great works of art, it draws a lot of inspiration from and is littered with references and allusions to many great works that have come before it. And in this game's case, the vast majority of those references and allusions are to things that are very classically French. And if you're not familiar with French art or French themes, poetry, literature, or painting, then these things might escape you. And if they do, you're missing out on some of the richness and some of the layered depth that the creators of this game have really baked in, whether consciously or not, given that the studio is French. Today we're going to break down some of those themes. We're going to unpack the places in the game that they can be observed. And we're going to talk a little bit about what makes those themes so classically French and how Expedition 33 draws on that rich cultural tradition to share something truly special with gamers across the world. The first theme that we're going to explore in relationship to Expedition 33 is the artistic French theme of Le Flâneur, which roughly translates to the stroller or the wanderer. But it's much more than that. It's a specific type of wanderer. It's an urban wanderer. It's a disaffected, detached, observant wanderer who drifts along, observing the city that they stroll through and reflecting in a very meditative way about the spectacle that they're observing and their place amidst the chaos. The concept of Le Flâneur was really originated in the 1800s in the city of Paris, and it was popularized, or at least first widely written about in this sense, by the poet Baudelaire. And this is an idea that took root and really fed into a very prominent and important philosophical movement in French culture that you've probably heard of called Existentialism. So this idea of the wanderer was picked up by other philosophers and authors such as Camus, which can be seen in the novel L'Étranger, The Stranger, with Meursault, and the way that he drifts through life, and he's very observant, but he feels disaffected and detached. And so this theme is a very deep and resonant existential theme in French art because it taps into the part of us that can sometimes feel a little detached. In Expedition 33, we're introduced to characters who exhibit qualities of Le Flâneur right away, including Gustave, who really doesn't quite fit in his surroundings, or Maëlle, who has bounced around from place to place since she was a young child and always feels like a visitor even in her hometown. So to frame the story through the lens of Le Flâneur, the wanderer, is a very powerful device, not just in terms of its intrinsic, interesting nature and point of view, but also in the way that it directly taps into a very long and storied tradition in French art in that way. The next traditionally French theme that I want to connect to Expedition 33 is the concept of l'angoisse, which translates to anguish. But it's not just your everyday run-of-the-mill anguish, it's a very specific kind that is truly existential in its roots, and it's really meant to be related to this sense of meaningless, or even a sense of terror in terms of the way that the world just doesn't seem to make sense, and yet you have choice. You have freedom to deal with the nonsense of the world in any way that you see fit. And so the juxtaposition of boundless choice with a world that doesn't seem to invite much logical choice at all can create this paralysis that really can define a person's sense of self or the way that they look at and move through the world. So I think even right away through the prologue of Expedition 33, we're introduced to the concept of the gommage, which translates to the erasing. And that's a very absurd and anguish-filled and meaningless type of frame to be born into, where that's a reality, that people simply disappear once they reach a certain age. And so, what are folks in Lumiere meant to do with that knowledge? How does one live their life when they understand that they're marching towards the edge of a cliff? So, again, the juxtaposition of the freedom, the choice, even in an absurd and meaningless world, to live what you have in the way that you see fit. It's a very powerful and complex question, and it's one that Expedition 33 deals with right from the very beginning. The next very French theme that we're going to connect to Expedition 33 is the concept of la beauté du néant, which translates to the beauty of nothingness. And this is arguably the most classic of all the French themes, and one that probably gets poked fun at a little bit just because it is so very common in French art. And at a surface level, I think this is going to manifest as characters brooding, as loss followed by silence and mourning, and just the absence of a loved one, and the kernel of hope that's planted at the end of that, where the character attempts to find even the smallest bit of beauty in the loss, in the absence. And so, this is found throughout French cinema. It's found throughout French poetry, particularly symbolist poetry, perhaps best typified by the poet Mallarmé, or even in the way that Claude Debussy approached a lot of his music, in the way that silences were introduced, and the way that these ethereal textures really tried to not overcomplicate the soundscape, but to suggest beauty in nothingness. And once again, in Expedition 33, there's a lot of loss in this game. Without getting into spoilers, we know that grief and loss, it's a huge element of what the game is trying to speak to or meditate on. And just as these classically French works and classically French artists have explored in the past, the game really tries to live in those spaces for a little bit and let the characters explore the beauty of nothingness and try to see if they can find that seed of hope, even in the bleakest and most desolate moments. The French artistic trope of l'échec sublime, or the sublime failure, is a very powerful and also very central theme in French art over the last couple of centuries. And the idea here is there is a noble and worthy idea or task or attempt that a character is mustering up everything they have left to give it their best try, but ultimately, no matter what they do, it is doomed to failure because the odds are just too high against them. And so this reconciliation of the nobility inherent in taking up the sword even when you know that you can't win, the symbolic action of confronting an unbeatable challenge and doing it anyway, and doing it in a meaningless world, is an idea and a theme that the French have traditionally found a very beautiful one. And if you have been introduced to existentialist ideas at all in the past, this might make you think of the myth of Sisyphus by Camus, where it's the story of Sisyphus needing to roll that boulder up the mountain every single morning, and it's just torturous. And every morning when he wakes up, he's back at the bottom of the hill and has to do it all over again. But in Camus' mind, Sisyphus is happy because he recognizes his task as absurd, and he chooses to do it anyway. He smiles and rolls the boulder anew every single morning, and it's in that choice and the acceptance of the absurd and the tenacity to continue anyway that the French feel that profundity is to be found in that space. And so in Expedition 33, we have a very similar situation where there are seemingly insurmountable odds, and There's no logical justification or rationale as to how the expedition could possibly succeed. And in fact, they make it a point of pride to leave notes behind for the ones who come after. So doomed is their attempt considered to be that part of their protocol is to ensure that they're laying the bricks for the next expedition to walk on. And so that is something that you can see they take so much pride in, and it's such a part of their identity and such a part of the ethos of being an expedition member that there's really no greater sense of pride or accomplishment than to be able to do that. So to take up the doomed mantle and to do it anyway and to make it a little bit easier for the next person, that is just the typification of this idea of the sublime failure in French art. One thing that we'll see in a lot of 20th century French art is the idea of le temps dissous, or the dissolution of time. It's essentially an artistic device where time is nonlinear. It breaks down and the lines blur in between what's memory, what's reality, what's fantasy, what's consciousness, what's the afterlife. It's fluid, it's not fixed, and it's not clear, it's not explained, and it's intentionally left ambiguous because there's a beauty in that ambiguity that suggests that the human spirit, or the soul, if you will, is not pinned down by the sense of time in the way that our daily, everyday human life tends to make it seem. And so it's a device to show kind of the deeper motivations or the almost metaphysical factors at play throughout the arc of a great story. And of course, in Expedition 33, with the flashbacks and the cutscenes and the fact that we're in this kind of magical realism type of universe where we're really not sure exactly what things are expected by the characters and what things kind of exist outside the rule book of the universe. This device of time is used to great effect to enrich characters' backstories, to stress the incredulity that the characters experience as certain things happen to them on the continent. We see this a lot with Maëlle and a lot of her flashbacks and her scenes. So, again, the dissolution of time, very common in French cinema from the mid-20th century, people like Jean Cocteau, but also, I think, best exemplified by the author Marcel Proust and his famous work In Search of Lost Time, which is all about memory and trying to recapture the feelings and joys and experiences from your past and reconciling that with the fact that they're really not something that you can grasp because they're gone forever. So this flow through time and this almost tragedy of time, it's a very French concept, and it's one that Expedition 33 explores in great detail. The next French theme to explore that we see in this game is the concept of le mal du siècle, and that translates roughly to the evil of the age or the sickness of the age. And really what it is this idea that the modern person who's living in the society that they find themselves born into feels disillusioned, feels disaffected, feels almost like they were born in the wrong era. And it creates a common French trope of a character who is world weary, who's sort of the grizzled, I've seen it all, I've done it all, nothing can really affect me anymore. I've built this tough shell, and I'm this anti-hero, often combined with the idea of le Flâneur, the wanderer. So it's, again, this kind of gruff central figure who moves through the world as the weary anti-hero and reminisces about the state of the age that they find themselves in. And so it's this terminal sickness of the age that can't be cured because you can't change the era that you were born into. And so it's a a person who's permanently displaced. And I think Expedition 33 shows this in a lot of different ways. I think in terms of Lumiere and it being the only real world that these characters have ever known. And a lot of this counterfactual type of thinking where they imagine if things were different, if they could live full lives and have children at whatever age they want and see their children grow up and know what it's like to be old. And so in the game's case, I think people have a pretty good argument for why there's a sickness of their age, but it's sort of the concept taken to an extreme in this dystopian, fictionalized universe, but it stems from a very common device that is really popular in that mid-20th century era of French art, but also even earlier in the late 19th century and early 20th century with folks like the poet Paul Verlaine, and again, Baudelaire being really the genesis of that Verlaine-esque symbolist movement. And that brings us to our final French theme throughout the traditions of symbolism, existentialism, just French art more broadly throughout the centuries, and that is the concept of le masque, the mask, in case you couldn't translate that one. And this one is so classic that it has its roots very early in human recorded history. It's a concept that's been around in art for a very long time, and the French have a particular take on the mask. So as you might imagine, the concept of the mask deals in the tension between who we are on the surface and how we present ourselves to the world versus the hidden inner world that we experience and show ourselves. And so it brings up a lot of questions. If I spend 16 hours a day with my mask on, presenting it to others, and only take it off for a few moments before falling asleep, who am I? Am I the mask, or am I someone else? The lines can begin to blur. And how does authenticity play into all of this? Does your wearing of a mask due to necessity denigrate your authenticity of the way that you're living your life? And how does society at large play into that necessity of mask wearing? And so, this is a particular obsession in the French symbolist movement, which is really that first half of the 20th century in French poetry and literature, again, thinking of folks like Mallarmé and Baudelaire. And it's really a question of identity. And so the utilitarian way in which we wear a mask to cope with the world that we're in becomes a reaction to the absurdity of life itself. Now, this one is a little trickier to talk about for Expedition 33 because I think we start brushing up against spoiler territory, and I'm not looking to do that in this video. But as you play, you'll find that this theme of masks shows up again and again in the game. And when I saw this, it kind of gave me a little smile because it really made me realize just how much of an overt nod to French culture and art the game's team was really putting into play here. So my hat's off to them. My mask is off to them. How about that? For putting together such an amazing game and really tapping into something a little bit deeper. I think it's one of the reasons why so many people have resonated with this game. I'm sure I'll review it here on the channel at some point. Of course, it's a great game, but to me, as someone who I've said in my reviews and other videos, I'm not a huge story guy in games, but listen, when you've got game themes digging into things like the French decadent movement from the end of the 19th century and Baudelaire and Verlaine and Mallarmé and Camus and all of these great artists who I admire deeply, I couldn't help but really lean in and take notice all the way up to the point of creating this video. That's how inspired I was by the serious and pretty loving treatment of these great themes throughout art in a medium that I think is sorely lacking this level of depth, at least most of the time. Well, that's going to wrap it up for kind of a different video here. I hope you enjoyed it. If you were curious, leave a comment below if you need to know more about what some of these themes mean, or if you noticed something else in the game and you want me to try to unpack that as well. My background is in literature and art, particularly European, including French art specifically, so happy to tackle any of that. And on your way out, do me a favor, tap that like and subscribe button. I'm just a wanderer trying to make my way in an absurd YouTube algorithm. It would help me out a lot. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.